Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. Today, we're going to look at an introduction to cybersecurity compliance. So what are you going to learn today? We're going to go over a definition of cybersecurity compliance. We're going to rank some of the compliance models, provide an overview of some of the major compliance frameworks, and take a look at some of the basic control areas within compliance frameworks today. So the agenda is we're going to cover compliance basics and then touch briefly on some of the Cybergence services. We're going to keep it simple. So a bit of housekeeping. We are limiting the scope to IT and cybersecurity compliance. We're not going to go well beyond that. There are a lot of different frameworks that are out there, so it's not intended to be a complete coverage. I'm primarily focusing on the area of the United States. I do know like Canada has PIPEDA, for example. We're not going to be touching to that. And there's a lot of others that are available. It is intended to be high level. It's not geared towards any specific framework. And there's a large number of differences depending on which framework you're focusing on. And for this conversation as well, I assume at least you have some minimal knowledge of some of the cybersecurity practices. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going in depth for each one of those. So let's jump right into it for compliance basics. So cybersecurity is a practice of following a framework set by governments, industry standards, et cetera, to protect information. Frameworks can be laws, regulations, or standards, but quite often companies still need to meet them. It's still an incredibly important part of the cybersecurity framework. So as you can see here, and the size of the compliance is going to be different depending on which standard and what you're doing, et cetera, and depends on how robust of a program you have as well. But compliance is part of cybersecurity, but cybersecurity should, in most cases, be larger than just compliance, because you can be compliant without having a great cybersecurity program. That being said, compliance can add a lot to cybersecurity, so it is still an incredibly important part of that. But what are the value of these? So obviously, it's a business protector. You can create the minimum standards that you're going to work from for an organization. You're going to take a look. It's good business enabler as well. Oftentimes, there are legal or regulatory requirements that you have to follow. And there's also business partner requirements too. Sometimes they're going to come in and say, you need to be doing X, Y, and Z, or you need to meet this compliance framework or a framework in order to do business. Otherwise, they're going to cut out their business from you. Also, it's a governance tool. It helps to validate some of the basic IT and cybersecurity practices, and it's also a method of reducing risk. So there's a lot more that can be said for governance and compliance, but at least it's a big step in the right direction. I think for a lot of organizations, it's extraordinarily valuable. So let's take a look a little bit about compliance versus audit. Oftentimes there's a bit of confusion in a lot of times with the executives and understanding what the roles are, because there are two very different fundamental functions. When you're talking about compliance, it's working to the state of becoming compliant. It's about being able to demonstrate the compliance to the auditors. Sometimes that does include some self-assessments, which is different than the audit. The audit is a formalized process for assessing an organization against a framework. And so that's a little different standard. And there is a more loose definition of audit that's out there. You're doing an assessment. It's sometimes referred to as an audit. But when I talk about audit in this sense, it is that formalized process. Also, processes may vary depending on the framework or criteria. Some frameworks must submit back to a centralized authority to complete the process. So there's a lot that goes on within the background of performing an audit. Let's talk a little bit about scoping today. Some frameworks will have the scope determined for you. It's got to be legal. There are certain things that you have to take into account. Some frameworks allow you to choose things. Some of it's based on the data. What's your data flow? And are you processing the data? Those are different criteria that could come up. So a lot of times what they want to do is they want to take a look at the IT side, where is IT accessing the information from and what type of system? And then what are the systems where the data is processed, housed, or scoped, depending on the organization. IT, as I mentioned, IT is often in scope, but some frameworks also allow you to choose your scope. For example, you could choose one particular system to be the scope. But if you're choosing one particular system, that doesn't mean all the other controls are no longer applicable. Everything's still applicable, but what you're doing is you're focusing in on that one system. So for example, you could choose an Active Directory server as the scope for some types of assessments. And if you choose that, well, you still have to have your firewalls in place. You have to be doing vulnerability management. They might check it against the Active Directory server. So that's part of the scope of what you're looking at here. There are, that's part of the specific systems. Also, you can time scope it as well. Like you could choose 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. It depends on the framework. Some frameworks can allow you to do that, some will not. And so choosing the scope can really help you decide what direction to go. So for example, if you needed to meet a SOC 2 type 1 or type 2 audit, for example, you could choose a 3-month framework because you spent the previous 6 months getting up to speed and you only have 3 months where you're really going to be compliant. So you could choose that as your scope. So you have some options, but a good thing to note here. But let's take a look at some of these frameworks. I think there's a lot of stuff to go into here, and I kind of broke it down. You can see I've got a framework legend over on the right-hand side towards the bottom. But you see here that there's healthcare, federal, credit card security, lots of different types of security, and a lot of different frameworks going to be used in different contexts. And don't be too specific with this. For example, you could say New York Department of Financial Services over on the left-hand side, the NYDFS. That's a specialty one because it applies to New York State. It doesn't apply to any other states. So if you're a financial services organization and you're only in Florida, this may not be applicable. But if you also are in New York, it may become applicable. But the general point here is that this is supposed to be a very generalized process for looking at these things. Generally speaking, when you look over on the left-hand side, those tend to be a little bit easier. That's the NIST CSF, which everybody talks about today. Now, NIST CSF just put out version 2 of their framework. They were in 1.1 before. Now they've done a lot of updates to it, which is a fantastic thing. They've added the concept of governance into it. But you'll notice here there's SOC 2. There's type 1 and type 2 that's listed. Type 1 is a little bit easier because when you're going through doing the assessment, all the controls are still applicable. You still have to have policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines and things. But what's different about it is that you have to show one example you did something right. Whereas SOC 2, they might say, okay, show us all your change control tickets. We're going to do a sampling of, say, 20 of those tickets, and then we're going to make some determinations about those changes to try to determine, are you doing things appropriately? Are you doing things inappropriately? There's ISO 27K, which is a little bit more common in Europe, but definitely is used here in the United States. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, that is part of healthcare. That is the foundational framework that came out for protecting healthcare information. CIS isn't a formal compliance framework, but it does have some clout in the industry if you're meeting CIS. It's definitely a step above what you're going to find some of the others, and it's a little bit technical in terms of its orientation. It originally came down from the FBI top 20 list, and then it became the SANS top 20, then became the Center for Internet Security top 20. And so I want to make sure that you're very clear. For those who are familiar with CIS, this is different than the CIS baselines, which are used to harden specific systems. They have their own framework. It's now referred to the CIS top controls for being able to assess all the different criteria. So it's not a bad place to get started. The PCI DSS, you're looking at, roughly 400 controls. And what that's to is related to credit card information. But you'll notice here, you've got some of these in black, and these are the federal ones. So you're going to see NIST 853, which does go into FISMA and some other things. And then you've got FedRAMP noted below and CMC. These are the federal level frameworks and requirements. Usually for the organizations that have the data, that's where 853 or FedRAMP is going to be coming in. But if they're cloud, that's where FedRAMP really applies. But CMMC is for other organizations who wish to do business with the government. It's a pretty strong standard, and it does include some maturity models into it, but not all frameworks that are listed here do include frameworks. But for example, quite often when you're looking at the NIST 853 or the various FISMA frameworks that go into NIST 853, they're going to apply a maturity model into that. And we'll talk more about maturity models later, but that's one of the reasons that these things become a little bit tougher. But you will notice here that high trust is going to be, I put it at level 4 or level 5 in terms of its complexity. And the reason why is to do a high trust assessment, you have to do a risk assessment of an organization prior to doing that. And what they do is they determine the number of controls based on that risk assessment. I have seen, over 600 controls required, and I've seen as little as 300 controls required for high trust. So that's an important part of this. So there's a lot of other things we could touch on from a framework perspective, but this is the general overview, and we're talking about compliance within the United States. And a couple of these two touch slightly beyond that. So let's go into some of the basic types of controls that are required for different frameworks. Now, again, some frameworks may not require certain things here, some do. It depends on the framework, depends on the focus, but a lot of them are trying to be holistic. And I think that's the important message to get into that. And each one is going to frame it in their own way. Some of them are just going to ask questions along these lines because they're going to be like maybe 100+ questions long. Others, as I said before, could be up to 600 or more. So just take this with a grain of salt, but it's to give you the general idea of what do a lot of the frameworks tend to care about. Incident response is a really critical one. You've got to have all of that done. Threat and vulnerability is another big one. This is the penetration testing, the vulnerability assessments, the vulnerability managing process, and so on. Identity and access management. This includes some of the physical security that I note below, but what does your identity program look like within your organization? Are you taking a look at terminated employees and checking them against Active Directory to validate that they're there? That's a really critical part of that. Configurations are also a big part of it. Not all frameworks require configurations, but they're an excellent thing to do just to make sure that your systems are secure. Application security. Now, this is the one that always sort of puzzles me because it's so critical for many organizations, but some of the frameworks out there, they barely touch on application security. And so that's something that's a little bit of a surprise. But one thing about a lot of these frameworks, they tend to be a little bit old. They're not up to date with all the latest controls. They don't keep on top of everything, but they're okay to get started. To me, they're a stepping stone towards proper security. But let's go ahead and jump over the governance side. Most of these frameworks require things like policies and procedures. A lot of them are going to have maturity baked into them. We'll touch on that in a couple slides. Training, like security awareness training, but also what type of plans do you have? Do you have a disaster recovery plan, incident response plan, business continuity planning? Making sure that you've got that planning aspect of the organization as a way to be prepared for when things actually take place. There's key performance indicators. When you talk about something like high trust, that's part of their scoring rubric to make sure that you are paying attention to what's going on. Now, they've got a more complicated scoring rubric, which we're not going to touch on today, but you do see the key KPIs are an important part of it. Now, some of you may be scratching your head on this who are not familiar with the compliance space. It oftentimes is much larger than just IT. So, for example, what are your hiring practices? Would you do a background check? Do you validate that they don't have any issues? So HR security is part of this whole thing. There's risk management, of course. These are managing the different types of risks that are out there. This can be enterprise risk management, which is required by some frameworks. And this is kind of a higher level set of risk management activities and what you're going to find within the cybersecurity space. And of course, change control. Now, there's some of you who are used to corporate change control, and this is change control for an entire organization. But then there's usually what they're referring to in most of the frameworks is standard change control within IT. How do you make an IT change? You have a configuration item that needs to take place. It's got to go through change control through one mechanism or another. So let's take a look at assessment efficacy here. To me, this is important to consider. When you're looking at the different frameworks, maybe you're deciding on what to do for your organization. I like to take a look at a lot of different factors. Generally speaking, though, if you're doing a self-assessment, they're considered much less efficacious. A lot of people are going to say, yep, I'm doing a great job. I assess my own work. I'm great. And they walk out the door, but there are a lot of others here. There's internal or external. Let's go ahead and start with the internal. It can be a separate department that's doing an assessment. That's a little bit more efficacious. Has a little more clout behind it because at least you've got the appropriate separation of duties. There are gap assessments that can be done. And that's okay if you're doing the self-assessment. We're saying, hey, we've got some issues here, but what are we actually doing? There's testing and sampling. These are different parts of the same thing. Like I mentioned before, the SOC 2, they're going to go through and do that sampling mechanism, but you might test a specific control on a regular basis, especially if it's considered a critical control. Interviews are also important. A lot of times, though, if you're talking about that, unless you've got a framework you're working from, interviews aren't always the most effective mechanism because, again, people are going to say, look, they're going to pat themselves on the back. When you're working on external controls, however, And that's where things are a little bit better. So you've got an external organization who is trained to look at these things on a regular basis. They're providing gap assessments or doing different types of testing and sampling. And they also can do interviews. And those tend to be a little bit better because they're going to check for things that other people may not be aware of. So it's a really great place to start for most organizations. All right, so let's take a look at maturity here. There's a lot of maturity models that are out there. This right here is based on the Capability Maturity Model Integration, also known as CMMI. And the initial is you slap something in place. Maybe you installed your firewall and it's, there. At least the initial is done. Managed, meaning it's part of your change control process. Before you make changes, you're going to do some work with it, and that's part of the manage process. Defined is that you've got policies and procedures. You got a standardized process that's being used within your organization. And then quantitatively managed, you're using those key performance indicators to say, how good are we doing? We'll go back and taking a look at it, managing it and saying, are we meeting our criteria? And then there's optimized. This is where you're continually improving, making changes, and doing a good job paying attention to that. So it's beyond all of those other phases. So it's getting a little more innovative. So a lot of organizations like to strive towards level 3. Some of them move up to level 4 as part of their process. Very few companies move into the optimized route. Some of them do have different elements of that within their program, but generally speaking, you're not going to find optimized across the board. So that covers on the basics. We're going to cover more on compliance at a later point in time, but now let's go ahead and jump into some of the Cybergent's compliance-related services. We do have virtual CISOs, but we also can do things like white glove compliance training. And this is where we could sit down and work with your teams and help educate them and train them or provide stories around it. That's part of that compliance training process. There's gap assessments. We can do a simple gap assessment. We can take a look at it and determine what those gaps are and go from there. I do recommend that if you're going to be getting a formalized audit, unless you want to get that white glove service, gap assessments are better done because what a lot of companies do that are in there, they're going to take something, and it depends on the framework, but they're going to take the assessment criteria and they're going to add their own flavors into it. So you have to keep using that same organization over and over again to make sure that you're compliant. But gap assessments are a tried and true method. If you're in an organization that's looking at controls in a very thin fashion and only getting the rock bottom minimum done, that's where the compliance gap assessments can come in, and they can be very helpful to figure out how do you slice that bread, metaphorical bread, very thinly. If you want somebody to run a compliance program or looking at cybersecurity program building, those are some other things. But my point is here, reach out and have a conversation. We're good at taking a look at these things, and this is part of what Cybergence does. But I want to thank you very much for your time. Feel free to follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, X, and so on. And thank you very much for following us. And go ahead and click on the link or like it and follow us and pay attention to what's going on. We appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.